was the issue land ownership, or was it mineral rights, or a combination? In other words, I have this sort of mythological narrative that I've carried around for years, that it wasn't so much that people in Appalachia didn't own the land, it's that they inadvertently gave away the mineral rights. So was it a combination of who owned what? And when people did own the land, they're having given away the mineral rights, or was it more about actually that the companies owned the land as well as what's underneath the land?
It's both. In Tennessee, it was primarily the combined ownership. They owned the land and they owned the minerals underneath the land. And they got that through various dubious means, dating back to the turn of the century. Oftentimes they would buy the mineral rights first, right? So if you were in the 1890s, if you were a small farmer and somebody approached you and said, we want to give you some money to get the minerals under your land, and you would say, why not? I need the money, right? They gave me cash. I'm not using those minerals. I'm using the surface. And that process happened a lot. And then there was also a whole series of other legal tricks and other ways that land and minerals were handed over.
Okay.
Now in Kentucky, more so than Tennessee, this became known as the broad form deed. And what this meant was that the courts later, when this time strip mining wasn't in anybody's imagination. So you couldn't imagine that by giving up your minerals several hundred feet down, your land could be destroyed at a later time. In Kentucky, the courts held that the mineral rights took precedence over the surface rights. So wow. This led later to huge, terrible things of bulldozers showing up at people's doors and saying, waving their legal thing, we have rights to your minerals under your land, and simply bulldozing their historical home places. And there were some very famous protests in the 60s, 70s, the time that we were beginning that work of people lying in front of the bulldozers and standing in front of the bulldozers.
At the risk of sounding terribly parochial, this is so resonant of what happened with Dodger Stadium and Chavez Ravine, the images of bulldozers showing up to take homes from people under very questionable.
And of course, later the scale of strip mining meant that we saw in the region was massive, and the mineral rights tend to take precedence. Okay. But in Tennessee, for reasons, that's a good question. I'd have to go back and refresh my memory. I think the broad form deed didn't exist in the same way, and they tended, at least the companies that we looked at, tended to own both the land and the minerals underneath it. So the American Association, which was one of the largest one that I studied, this British company, held over 80,000 acres of land, cutting across parts of Claiborne, Campbell, and Bell County, and up into Bell and Whitley County in Kentucky. And they would own that in total. They own the land, they own the minerals underneath. And they probably own some separate mineral rights as well. But the problem was generally that the assessors didn't take into account, because it was a highly difficult thing to do, the value of what was underneath. Well, that was, and they barely took into account the value of the land on top. At the time, on the American Association land, Continental Oil, Consolidated Coal, which was owned by Continental Oil, had one of the largest deep mines in Tennessee. And they and the American Association paid very little. And I think I told the story last time when we saw there were some pasted figures on the tax rolls, and we said, where do those figures come from? And this assessor's office told us, well, Alvarado E. Funk, the head of the company, delivers his own tax appraisal every year because we don't know how to do it, and he would just self-declare a minimal amount. And that was what was going on at the time. The basis of our complaint was that it did violate the spirit of the law, which means you had to equitably tax property, and they weren't doing that. So, in some sense, but the bigger wrong as I said, it was a bigger than the tax problem. The bigger wrong was the taking away of massive resources from the people in that region, building this historical legacy of control and exploitation and power. And then, of course, using never caring for those land and resources through, and coming in later with destruction of strip mining and so on, which then had other impacts, of course, on the people who still retain their land. They got secondary spill-offs. They got, as we saw in the Stripping of Appalachia film, their land became flooded and so on because of what was going on the large corporate owners' land, with no ways to hold them to account.